industrial stormwater at that time. If anyone should require audio assistance during the conference, please press star and then 0 on your touch-tone telephone. As a reminder, this conference call is being recorded. I would now like to introduce your host for today's conference, Ms. Jennifer Bartz. Ms. Bartz, you may begin.
Good morning. I'm Jennifer Bartz with Foley and Lardner, and I'm pleased to welcome you to today's web conference. In this program, we address the new California Draft General Industrial Stormwater Permit, properly preparing a stormwater pollution prevention plan. Released by the California EPA in February 2011, we will talk more in depth about how these regulatory changes will impact your business. Joining us today are 3 outstanding speakers, but before I turn the program over to Wayne Rosenbaum for introductions, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's program will last approximately 2 hours. The PowerPoint presentation is available on our website at foley.com/CA Industrial Stormwater, or simply click the print icon on the bottom right-hand side of your screen to print a PDF. If you experience problems with live meeting, please call 866-493-2825 for technology assistance. For audio assistance, dial star, then 0 on your telephone to reach an operator. Today's program has been set up in both a discussion and an interactive question and answer format. We encourage you to submit written questions during the program. Simply click Q&A on the menu bar of your screen and type your question. We will respond to written questions and also take live questions at the end of the program. When the formal presentation concludes, an operator will join us on the line and provide instructions as to how you can ask live questions. To ensure you get the most out of today's presentation, we encourage all participants to maximize the PowerPoint to full screen usage. You can do so by hitting the F5 button on your keyboard. As a reminder, today's program is being recorded and will be available on Foley's website in the next few days. Foley will also apply for CLE credit after the web conference. If you did not supply your CLE information upon registration, please send an email to Jennifer Bartz, that's me, at jbartz@foley.com. Now I'm very pleased to turn today's presentation over to Wayne Rosenbaum.
Wayne Rosenbaum. I'm a partner with Foley and Lardner, and we have been, as a firm, looking at this new permit for some period of time because it is still a permit in development. And so one of the purposes of these webinars is for participants to have the opportunity not only to understand what impacts this new permit may have on them, but also, and we would strongly encourage you to do so, have the opportunity to participate in the notice and comment process in the development of a final draft permit. With me today is Sean Porter, a Senior Technical Advisor from SCS Engineers, and Sean will today really be taking the lead discussing the modifications, the changes to the SWPPP preparation elements of this new permit. And Chris Hayes from the State Water Resources Control Board, and Chris brings to us really some unique perceptions because not only does he have industrial background on his own, but is intimately involved in the permit development process and can kind of give us a sense of where that process is. This is a series of webinars. We've already completed the overview. Today we'll be talking about the SWPPP. In future webinars, we will continue to talk about the monitoring and reporting program requirements and groups and planning for the future. How do we adapt to and implement this permit in the most effective and efficient manner? Again, today we are going to talk about, in this session, some background, the project required documents, what are the standards of compliance for the SWPPP, and the issue of who might be excluded from having to prepare a SWPPP. But before we do so, in terms of the background, just as a reminder, these permits are what we call NPDES permits, and they arise out of the Federal Clean Water Act. That is, the state water board and the regional boards are delegated the authority terms of the regulation of those stormwater discharges, the state also relies in some part on its own state statutes for the Cologne to more fully attempt to protect water quality. We are talking about discharge standards for industrial stormwater, and again, today we're going to talk more and more about what is industrial stormwater, who is an industrial facility, who is going to become part of this program who may not have been part of the program in the past, i.e. conditionally exempts. We're going to talk about compliance standards, but primarily compliance standards as they pertain to preparing the stormwater pollution prevention plan and its implementation. And we're going to reflect back on the previous permit in order to kind of compare and contrast. Before we go on then to begin to talk about the PRDs or the permit registration documents, Chris, can you give us some sort of update as to where we are in this process?
Sure, Wayne. It looks like we should have a draft. This will be a formal draft for public review towards the end of August, and then review process would take place with a public hearing scheduled for October 4th, 2011, and then modifications to the permit in response to those comments received, and a board adoption hearing scheduled for January 10th on kind of the final permit that I'd expect to see sometime mid-December. And we're, of course, fighting all the holidays that occur that time of the year. But that's the tentative schedule, and I think the dates that are unlikely to change without something really getting dramatically in their way as the January 10th adoption and the October 4th public hearing.
Okay. And you mentioned that we're going to that you anticipate the state's going to come out with what I guess I'm going to call a new draft permit.
Correct. The new draft permit will be reflecting all of the comments that have been received to date, and should be, I would expect, a pretty substantial change to what is on the street today in a couple of key areas, which I think we'll hit today.
Okay. How many comments did we have on the first version draft?
The first draft had over 250 comments received. Okay.
So it would appear that this permit really is getting a pretty broad interest across the state and various groups.
Very broad interest.
Okay, back to permit registration documents. I don't suspect that this portion is going to change significantly. And Sean, you want to talk us through the PRDs?
Sure. These are the permit registration documents that are going to be submitted up to the State Water Board website, the SMART, which is a similar system or same system that we saw under the construction permit. And those documents are the notice of intent, which would define your activity and the site location and things like that, and your industrial process. Site map, the SWPPP itself, which we'll talk more about here shortly, a fee, of course, and a signed certification statement. So these are the PRDs that are all going to be uploaded to the SMART system before you get your WDID number, and then at that point you'd have coverage under the permit.
I guess one question for you. We know in this permit, and I think it'll probably remain in this permit, that we have at least two exclusions, the non-exposure certification, the non-discharge certification. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that. For those folks, are they going to have to upload a SWPPP?
That's a good question, Wayne. I'm not exactly sure. It seems like they would need to submit the NOI along with the no exposure cert. That's how I would interpret it. Maybe Chris could comment on how those documents would be coupled together. But it seems, producing a SWPPP and then following that up with a no exposure or no discharge cert is wheel spinning.
Right, and the exact format that SMART is going to take on this issue hasn't been completed yet. But the expectation is that, yes, that the registration documents would be complete and considered for coverage when you had your no exposure certification in lieu of a SWIP.
Okay.
But that process is not final yet.
Right. And we can probably talk more about that as we move through this and the number of light industry users that potentially could be drawn in on this. But in any case, everybody needs to submit some type of PRDs.
Got it. Got it. One other thing we probably ought to point out on this slide is that these documents will need to have a signed certification statement by the approved signatory for the legally responsible party. And those of you who are with us on construction, we always talk about the legally responsible person as being the landowner, the individual with the interest in land. Here, it appears that the legally responsible person is going to be the facility operator. So if I am a tenant on a piece of property, it's not the landlord who's going to be responsible. It's going to be the tenant that operates the business.
Gotcha.
I have to find the cover. There we go. So, again, we get back to then what becomes the standard of compliance. And Sean, you want to?
We can just talk briefly about the, putting together the actual development of the SWIP for those who would be requiring that, and the implementation of that, potentially to meet an effluent limitation. Chris can probably talk a little bit more about the effluent limitations, or the NELs and the NALs, and how that's applicable to. Reporting on the SWIP results on an annual basis, and impact of noncompliance. So there could potentially be some kind of mandatory minimum penalties for noncompliance or municipal penalties. I think the big one here, the one to take home, is the citizen suit, the threat of citizen suit for your noncompliance. And since the data is going to be available on the SMART system, theoretically, the citizens have access to that, and it sort of brings in a new layer of transparency in these industrial programs, and perhaps making some of these industrial users more susceptible to these Clean Water Act violation lawsuits.
And Chris, this might be a good time to update us on the latest, I wouldn't want to call it gossip, the latest intelligence on numeric effluent limits and numeric action levels.
Okay, and I'm doing this, but recognizing this is not gospel. This could change. But current thinking, internal to the water boards as we're developing the draft that should soon hit the street, is that we will have action levels pretty consistent with those proposed in the past draft, with probably some changes. For instance, something like electrical conductivity may get bumped up a little bit, reflecting the coastal environment that exists throughout much of the state of California. So those numbers may be a little higher to reflect those high conductivities you might see near saltwater and in some of our more desert valleys. In conjunction with that, it is very likely, although again not certain, that effluent limitations, so NELs, would come out of this permit and would not be a part of it. So we would have action levels and ALs, but no NELs.
That's great. That's great news.
But let me make it clear, that's not necessarily gospel until the draft is issued.
And now might be a good time, we were talking before the webinar commenced, to kind of explain to our audience, when we talk about those people, the water board, what's the process that you folks use to try and integrate the thinking of 9 regions with a state board, et cetera?
Well, it's always a bit of a challenge because we do have 9 independent regions in the state of California for good reasons. There's very different conditions that exist in each of those 9 regions, and so we do not have unanimity of thought across those 9 regions. But we do all sit down together in work groups on various issues where there may be regional differences and try to come to a common understanding, which is what then is reflected in the final draft that's issued. On some issues, though, we do not come to common understanding, and then the state board makes the decision as to what will be in the draft permit. And then the regions can, in fact, provide comments on that draft permit if they want.
Got it. And just updating this slide, at the present time, then, it looks like mandatory minimum penalties may, I know the word may, come out of this permit, but I would certainly yeah, go ahead.
Well, yeah, they won't come out of the permit for things like failure to submit an annual report. So that there'll still be mandatory minimum penalties, but to have it based on an effluent limitation, they certainly are out. However, there will be required actions, or likely will be required actions in this permit as a result of approaching or exceeding an NAL, and failure to do those required actions could result in penalties. So there's likely to still be a penalty provision. It just won't be numeric effluent limit based.
Understood. So as an example, if I chose to ignore my obligations to file my PRDs, clearly that might still carry a mandatory minimum penalty.
Absolutely. That would be discharging without a permit.
Assuming the new variation on the permit says that if you exceed a numeric action level, you have to do A, B, and C, and I fail to do A, B, and C, I would still potentially be subject to mandatory minimum penalty.
That is correct.
We're just getting away from numbers and specific effluent limitations.
That's correct.
Got it.
But the citizens are the ones, I mean, I think you said it last week, I'm not afraid of you, I'm afraid of these guys, you know.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I think what we're going to see is through the municipal permits, drive by the water boards, et cetera, to see a more robust enforcement of the industrial permit. And that's a Wayne opinion, but I think that's probably coming, which probably means greater exposure to municipal penalties. But truly the issue becomes penalties that arise out of citizen suit enforcement. Because all of these other penalties, other than the mandatory minimum, the mandatory penalties, all of these other penalties are discretionary. And it becomes the municipality, the water board, the Department of Justice, or the citizen who then decides whether or not to take an enforcement action forward. So what a regional board might not consider sufficient to bring an enforcement action forward may be very different from what a citizen feels should be enforced. Or caution, Will Robinson, we met the enemy, they is us. And we seem to be having some problems moving the slides here. Oh, sorry.
Hi, Wayne.
Yeah.
Looks like a few of our audience members are having an issue hearing you guys. If you're able to speak up or get closer to the mics, that would certainly help them.
We can do that.
Thank you.
So when we talk about the requirement to implement the SWP, maybe one of the first things we want to talk about is, we've already said not everyone has to do a SWP. Who are the folks that don't have to do SWPs, and on what basis can a regulated facility avoid preparation of a SWP? And originally there were 3 potential categories: no discharge cert, no exposure cert, which we can talk about a little bit more in the beginning, in a moment, and then the G cert. But again, where are we on the G cert?
This is Chris again. it looks like within the draft that will be issued shortly, we'll continue to have a no discharge certification and a no exposure certification available to dischargers that would be in a otherwise covered SIC code. However, at present, and this is of course subject to change, so nothing I'm saying here is going to be cast in stone. The green GCERT kind of opt-out provisions, because of our inability to clearly define that at this time, is likely to not be a part of this, and that's disappointing to me and a number of others, but in fact, that's where things stand at the moment.
And Chris, you and I have certainly talked about that, and I think some of the people who comment on the permit may want to suggest that at least that be retained as a pilot option or some sort of option that maybe can be worked through the regional boards in order to ultimately develop standards that we can include in the next permit cycle. Because what I hear saying is, this is a good idea. We just don't know how to do it yet. And on the other hand, if we don't try some things, how do we find out how we're actually going to be able to do it? So that may be something that people want to comment on in the next permit cycle. No discharge certification is really pretty clear. Get your licensed professional civil engineer to certify that you can contain a 100-year storm event on your property. After you contain it, you can infiltrate it, you can evaporate it, you can use it for process water, you can send it down to sanitary sewer, you just can't discharge it. And that may work for some people who have needs for those waters, uses for those waters, the right kind of soils or locations where it can infiltrate, where you can demonstrate that there cannot be, and there is the other qualification, or you can demonstrate that there is no possible discharge to a water of the United States. Certainly something that people should be considering as an option. The other option, the no exposure certification, is pretty well described on the State Water Board's website. You have to answer affirmatively to 11 questions about what you do at your facility, how you do it, what kind of exposures exist. But if you can do that and have an engineer certify it, then you have a no exposure certification. The issues that one of the procedural issues that I think people need to think through is these certifications, at least in the current draft, must be renewed every year. So it is not that you are out of the system. It's not that you are not subject to the industrial stormwater permit. We are simply saying that for some people, there is an alternative route for compliance. And I think that's an important distinction to be made. You're still going to file, PRDs. You're still going to have an approved signatory. You're still going to pay, some fee to the state. It is not that you can say, well, gee, I don't discharge, I don't have to do those things. It just says that because I don't discharge, I am not being required a SWIP and a monitoring plan.
Right. Dischargers whose facilities include multiple SIC codes are authorized to file a single set of PRDs for coverage under the permit. And this is, of course, provided that the SWIP and the monitoring program addresses each one of these industrial activities on the site. I think there's a little hook in this, isn't there, Wayne? Maybe you could talk to us about here.
Again, this is something, as we've sat around the table before, we've wrestled with. I believe that what the permit says is, if you fall into one of the regulated SIC codes, all of which are posted on the State Water Board's website, you are subject to this permit. There is no, under this existing draft, there is no conditional exclusion. You are subject to the permit. However, the first question that we think folks need to ask themselves is, have they appropriately classified themselves under the SIC system? I don't think that, as an example, and we've talked about this, clearly the permit is intended to pull in people like industrial bakeries, but not necessarily small retail bakeries in Mrs. Fields Cookies, as an example.
But maybe they have the same SIC code.
But maybe they have the same SIC code. And so the first question in terms of compliance that a potential permittee should be asking themselves is, have I selected the appropriate SIC code?
Let me comment a little bit about this. This is Chris again. This is a critical issue. I don't think this is a critical issue in terms of the state board or regional board, because we can easily go out and make our own determination whether this is a retail or truly industrial activity, and we're not going to enforce necessarily. Well, I can say we are not going to enforce against a retail bakery. However, having that SIC code, if for some reason that retail bakery has chosen to use that as their code, they're subject to lawsuits from other parties besides us. So it does behoove them to look at that and make sure they're appropriately coding themselves.
Yes. And again, that takes us back to that previous slide. Certainly each of the enforcing agencies has enforcement discretion, and it's been our experience that they always use that and tend to use it appropriately. But this permit, like any other Clean Water Act permit, is subject to citizen suit enforcement, which may lead to different enforcement priorities. So now it's all yours, Sean. You can talk about that SWIP. If you have to do a SWIP,
it needs to be site specific. So this is one of those things that you can't just pull off the shelf and change the name and the date on it and put it back on the shelf and expect that it's going to work. Not under this new permit. It has to be kept at the facility. This is very similar to the way the current permit works, and it's updated annually if needed, and all the inspection forms and observation forms are included within that SWIP. Now, one of the things that we see with this draft permit, we also saw in the construction permit, is that they've put in this language about QSD and QSP, or qualified SWIP developer, qualified SWIP practitioner. Now, these acronyms are the same that we see in the construction permit, but keep in mind these are industrial. And so if you have a QSD or a QSP for construction, it's not necessarily going to transfer over. So I don't know if they're going to call this something else or put a little sub-I after the D and the P. But in any case, the development of and the practice and implementation of that SWIP must be done by these two specifically credentialed people.
And again, Chris, I understand that there may be some new thinking about who can be a QSD or a QSP.
This is a very rapidly evolving area. I think it's what I can say today is that the concept of a QSD and QSP will remain in the permit. There will be some clarity and perhaps removal altogether around the pre-qualifications. So it'll be either clarified and changed or removed as to what's necessary before you become approved by the state to operate as a QSD and QSP. And it is very likely that TASQA will be the administrator of the certification and testing program, and that it will be a QSD sub-I kind of program, QSD. The other part of this is defining exactly what are the responsibilities and duties of the QSP and QSD, and that is also rapidly evolving, and I can't speculate as to what that is going to be, but it should be quite a bit clearer in this draft that comes out at the end of August.
maybe we should point out that in the construction permit, the QSD prepares the SWP, the QSP implements the SWP. At least in this draft of this permit, it would appear that the QSD not only prepares the SWP, but oversees its implementation, which is a much broader role in my mind than we saw in construction.
That's correct, and that is some of the thinking that is evolving. There's some discussion that we may be able to have define a smaller facility for which a QSP, not a QSD, so QSPPP, would be able to both prepare and implement the SWP without being overseen by a QSD. But that thinking is evolving rapidly, and I cannot give any clear direction as to where that will end up in the draft.
The one thing you did mention, which I hear you saying that both, at least the current thinking is, both a QSD and a QSP are still going to have to go through training, and there's probably going to be some tests. But do I hear you saying that when you talk about pre-qualifications, who can be entitled to take the training and the test is evolving?
That's correct, Wayne. It's almost certain that, although again not certain, but almost certain that QSP and QSD qualifications will remain in the permit, and that will be subject to training and testing to get those qualifications administered by CASPA. Exactly what other pre-qualifications, if any, are required of those QSDs and QSPs is where there's likely to be a lot of change. And if I had to bet today, it would be that there's not a pre-qualification at all to become a QSD or a QSP.
So just some training and taking the state water board
exam
may be what it ends up being.
That's correct. But that is very, very much subject to change.
And as we've talked about in the past, I think this is going to be an area in which we're going to see a significant amount of comment from some groups who believe that there should be some specific educational training required, to other people who have made the argument that says, I know my facility best. Maybe I'm not a professional engineer, but I know my facility best, and I'm the best person to develop the SWP. And so I would expect to see a lot of commentary on this.
We expect that comment also, Wayne. Plenty of it.
The other high point of the slide that we might want to point out is when we talk about including information necessary to demonstrate compliance with the permit, we are talking about the who, what, when, where, why, and how of each proposed BMP. What are the conditions? As I read this permit, the SWP is going to have to identify pollutants of concern, receiving water issues, an analysis of why each best management practice was selected, and then how, with specificity, is that BMP going to be implemented. And so coming back to what Sean says, and I'm just expanding on Sean's comment, this ain't your dad's SWP anymore. This is really going to be a very individualized document, much like Deming model, for each and every facility, which is probably arguably why some of the issues about groups may no longer be, some of the arguments for groups may no longer be as valid as they were under the old permit. Okay, so this slide is still in here because we're not sure, but
this is where
but the existing permit
this is what we're looking at right now. But it appears that some of these may go bye-bye. But either way, it's good. I think it's bringing an awareness, and people need to understand that there is a level of expertise that is required for preparing and implementing the SWP, whether you have pre-certs or not. So, but again, I think this is just sort of summarizing what type of, whether it's QSD or QSP, you can be with these different registrations.
And I would take it a step further. If I'm a facility operator, we don't know whether these qualifications are going to stay in or not.
Right.
And I think it's going to be very difficult. Assume they stay in for a moment. I think it's going to be very difficult to go shopping for a QSD and a QSP, 30 days before the permit goes into force. So it may behoove you as a facility operator to be thinking about worst case scenario today. If it has to be a registered civil engineer, as an example, have I identified that civil engineer, and do I have somebody who can come online if required to do so? Because I don't think we're going to have, there may be some period of exemption, but I don't think it's going to be very long, assuming those stay in. Or in other words, be prepared. Okay, so who can be a QSP and QSD may still be up for grabs. And again, we've talked briefly about this, but Sean, you want to talk us through who the roles of these folks, at least as we currently see them?
Sure, yeah. For the D, we're looking at, he would basically be the author of, he'd, gather all the materials, bind it up into the SWP, probably do, my guess is probably do the initial site investigation and work with the QSP on development of that. And then, the discharger they're required to assign and send an individual from the facility who's authorized to implement the permit requirements to the training. So in both cases, under the D and the P, they would both need to, be trained and pass some kind of state water board exam. The D, again, would be the author and implementer, and the P would be the one probably doing the training and maybe the sampling, or at least he would have designees on site that would be doing the sampling for him. But my guess is some of the more comprehensive inspections and observations would probably need to be performed by the P, and some of the other, like the sweeping inspections and things like that, may be able to be performed by a designee of the QSP.
One of the things we have or are beginning to learn out of the construction permit, which I think is probably applicable here concerning the QSD and the QSP, is those people who are now training folks, the trainers of record. I am hearing, at least more and more frequently, those QSP and QSD candidates are asking the question, what's my liability? What happens if, it doesn't get done? And so in terms of a facility operator or, somebody who's designing these systems, I think there is going to have to be careful attention to both authority matching up with responsibility. If we're going to say that the QSP has the responsibility to make sure all of these BMPs are implemented, are we going to delegate to that QSP the authority to say, wait a minute, I got to have, an extra guy on each shift, or I've got to have a new sweeper, or I've got to, have, some field testing equipment, and have the the authority to make those commitments match up with the responsibility to make sure that the things get done. And I think no matter how this comes out in terms of how this gets carved up, this is something, and understanding that there may be some changes in the draft permit, this is something that I think is a core concept that people need to be thinking about now.
Absolutely.
Okay, so
the QSD can write the SWP, amend the SWP, certify the SWP, and of course, as the language is now, this must be a licensed civil engineer, a geologist or an engineering geologist, landscape architect, or professional hydrologist, plus take the State Water Resources Control Board training and the test. And this is all for the QSD. And I think the next slide is going to be the QSP, which is responsible for implementing the best management practices. And this is all of them, including the good housekeeping, observations, the sampling, and then this individual must take the State Water Resources Control Board training and some type of exam as well. So the last two slides are basically just expanding on what the D and the P are and what their roles are in the context of the SWP.
And although today's webinar does not deal with the monitoring the sampling program, I think it's really important in terms of your planning and your SWP development, et cetera, to remember that the QSP is really responsible for the do, check, and review portions of the Deming model, plan, do, check, and review. And so when we're looking at that QSP, we're looking at the qualification, who should we assign this task to? It's more than just getting the BMPs implemented. It's also being able to manage the monitoring and the testing program. Because remember, we're supposed to have a significant field testing obligations here as well. So I think that when you start writing the job description and the job qualifications for the QSP, you've got to have both of those parts together.
Absolutely. And I think, in my mind, the P is responsible for the sampling and the monitoring. And that's a big part of these industrial programs. Laboratory selection, the methods that you're going to use, all of that.
And
it's a big thing, and I think that it's good that there's some kind of language in there to address that. And we can talk more about that in our next webinar where we discuss the monitoring and reporting protocols.
Although digressing a bit, and one of the things that we had talked about in the past was maybe the concept of regional testing versus on-site testing. Not necessarily in exchange for group benefits, but, does it make sense to have this, this kind of testing program at every facility? Is it giving us the data that we really need? That's really going to tell us where the pollutants of concern are really coming from. And I would hope that in comments or maybe in future drafts, we can think about how do we look at use this permit in some way to facilitate looking at water quality on a more regional basis rather than on a site-by-site basis. Maybe in some way combining some of these testing obligations with some of the things that we have imposed upon or required the municipalities to do in their large and small MS4 permits. Okay, so what are the implements of the elements of the SWP?
Here's what you need to have in the SWP, and I think this image sort of tells a great story. I mean, it's, the days of the off-the-shelf, plug and play, change the name and address, pollution prevention plan are over. So within this SWP, you need to have an implementation schedule and define your performance standards. Planning and organization, so probably an organization chart and who's responsible for what, when, how. The map, the facility map needs to be more detailed now because there's more requirements on that, and sub-areas, sampling locations, observation points all need to be outlined very clearly on the facility map, including a list of significant materials, where they're stored, how they're handled, what the volumes are, a description of the pollutant sources, whether it's an industrial process in the corner of the property or it's a material storage. And if it's a potential source of pollutants, then it needs to be addressed, described, and BMPs assigned to it in the SWP. And, of course, the BMPs are specific to the use, so I would definitely encourage folks that are in the business of preparing these to be well-versed in all the different types of BMPs for industrial properties and what they can actually accomplish. The annual comprehensive facility site compliance evaluation is an annual form that is also included within that in the SWP.
You know, one of the things that I think is a sleeper in this list is planning and organization.
No, that's a big one.
As I kind of read this permit, we're really saying, first of all, we have to identify either specific individuals or specific positions to implement each element of the SWP. And no more generalities. Two, it says, I believe that you have to, in many of those positions, have a backup. If the QSP is not there, you know, because they're on vacation, they're on sick leave, whatever, who's going to step into the QSP's shoes? Who's going to be the substitute? The third piece of that planning and organization that I think is a real sleeper is training. I read this permit to require not only that training be done, but that training be fully documented. And so this is an additional task that I think is going to, fall to the QSP. It's going to fall to somebody, and it might be probably the QSP, to make sure that all of the individuals identified in that planning and organization understand their roles and are properly trained for those roles, and we have documented that that's happened.
I think a lot of this, these are the elements within. So again, I'll just kind of roll through them. Again, to be included in the SWP, of course, the facility name and contact information. That's going to be contact information for all involved. So the sweeping guy, the cleaning guy, the person who's implementing the BMPs, the person who's doing the weather watch, keeping track of the rainfall data, all of that. Contact information for the D and the P, of course, the site map, list of significant materials, and description of the sources of pollutants. One of the things that is interesting here is this receiving water criteria and how, in the context of TMDLs, for example, how we would address our discharge. Minimum BMPs, additional facility-specific BMPs, the annual comprehensive site evaluation, and then the dates that the SWP was prepared and the dates for any and all amendments within that SWP.
And maybe, Chris, you can talk more about receiving water criteria, 303D, TMDLs. What's the state board thinking here?
Well, we are required, we're required to include implementation of the TMDLs that have been issued within this permit, and that is being done, and that's taking a lot of time to make sure the language in each of the currently issued TMDLs is in fact incorporated in the permit. The other side of that is 303D listed water bodies where there's a pollutant that has exceeded a level, and so it's an impaired water body, and the debate is not resolved at this point as to exactly how to manage those 303D listed water bodies and how to deal with facilities that may have a pollutant that is contributing or potentially contributing to that listing. So we'll see when the permit comes out exactly how that is managed. Can't say yet.
And I guess for our listeners, maybe we can expand on it a little bit. From a legal perspective, what Section 303D of the Clean Water Act says is, if you have an impaired water body, and I'll make it up, for nutrients, okay, and if no TMDL has been established for that impaired water body, then there is no additional load is permitted. It's a zero discharge. So for folks that are there, okay, fine. But for new facilities, they, in my hypothetical, they must have a zero discharge of nutrients. Well, the other question, as yet unresolved on the 303D side is, I have ABC metal fabricators, and I sell ABC metal fabricators to Chris. Is that a new discharge, or is that an old discharge? And so there are some real questions here as to, you know, how the regional board, the state board is going to address these federal obligations, because they are federal obligations. It's not like we can say, well, gee, we don't want to talk about them. We're going to have to address them in some way.
Right. And that is the issue, Wayne. And what I can talk about is how the state of Washington, who recently issued their industrial permit, handled it, and that they did prohibit new discharges to 303D listed water bodies unless the discharger, and I'm very much simplifying their language, but unless the discharger, that new discharger, could demonstrate that they were not threatening to discharge one of those listed pollutants. So if they potentially could discharge nutrients to a nutrient-listed water body, they would not be allowed to go into the system.
Which has significant land use implications, as I think, you know. The other one that I have wondered about in this area is assuming that a TMDL, a total daily mass load, has been established. How is this permit going to allocate, if you will, shares of the TMDL to individual permittees? I use the trash TMDL as an example. If the trash TMDL says, okay, you can only put so much trash in and you're going to ramp down to 0, during the ramp down period, how do I allocate that to business X?
And that is part of the issue of incorporating this TMDL language into this permit. And we're looking to each of the regional boards are primarily the authors of the TMDL, so we're looking to each regional board to come up with language that will specify exactly how that is done, either across an industry class or across all industries that may be subject to this permit within that specific watershed. So that language is being incorporated into this permit from existing TMDL. Exactly what that'll say, I can't tell you at this point, but it will be in there.
I guess I would note that we have a lot of municipalities who are participating in these webinars, and I would think for those folks who have land use authority, these issues are going to be critical because it could have significant impacts on economic development. It could have significant impacts on zoning, on land use, all of those things that we have traditionally thought of as being within the purview of the local jurisdiction.
Schedule, implementation schedule. So this is basically, this slide is going to discuss what the timing is on this. So new dischargers need to develop and implement the SWP when the activity begins or when the operator changes. I think that operator change may have something to do with what you're talking about. You sell yours or you buy another one, and how that works out. The existing dischargers will continue to operate, but the SWP revisions will be due 90 days after permit adoption.
And do these provisions look like they're going to hold, Chris?
Yes. I wouldn't expect to see any changes here, with the possible note that at least in the construction permit, people are familiar with that will remember there was an adopted date and then an effective date, and that kind of model may hold true here. So we may have something that says these provisions would be 90 days after the effective date of the permit, which may be some period of time after the adoption.
The permit can't even go into effect more earlier than 100 days after the adoption, because you have to give EPA their time at that.
Right, and we recognize that you don't want to trade horses in the middle of the stream, so to speak. We're going to issue this right in the middle of the wet season throughout much of California, and if the model of the construction permit is a valid model, and I think it probably is, we didn't have that permit become effective until the end of that wet season.
So the QSD prepares the SWP, and the P would implement the SWP. We talked a little bit about both of those duties. One of the performance standards of the new SWPs is identifying and evaluating all the sources of pollutants, and that's a pretty tall order if you think about it, especially if you're going to use the EPA benchmark values as your goals. So that there's, TSS and conductivity, for example, can be a little over, and you're over the limits. Identifying and describing and implementing the minimum BMPs to achieve the BAT-BCT. Identifying and implementing timely revisions or SWP updates. Now, this last bullet here with the NELs, whether or not this sticks, the way the language is right now is that level 3 facilities need to ensure that the SWP meets all of the applicable numeric effluent limits. So they are, the way the language is now, the EPA benchmark values. And so if your discharge from your property is in excess of those values, they become limits for level 3 facilities, and this is when we would get into the mandatory minimum penalties and things like that. Now, again, this is risk level 3, or level 3, so you have to move your way up through the tiers. But I think some folks that I spoke with were telling me that if you use the EPA benchmark values right now, that a lot of these facilities would automatically become level 3 facilities.
Might take them 3 years to get there, but yes.
Yeah.
No, based on what Chris is saying, and this is some speculation, I expect what we may see in the next draft is the NEL goes away. The now, again, becomes if you exceed the benchmark or some standard that we're going to establish, you're going to have to do a corrective action report and implement that corrective action report. But I think the key is to that corrective action report is going to be how you justify that the new BMP that you have implemented meets the BAT-BCT standard. Again, I'm making up this hypothetical, but I blow through suspended solids. Okay, I file a corrective action report. I say, well, gee, I used to sweep once a week. Now I'm going to sweep twice a week. Is that sufficient to be able to say I've met BAT-BCT? Or is there a challenge that says, wait a minute, we really think you should be sweeping once a day? How are we going to, deal with that?
That's a very real issue, Wayne. I think that the first shot at that is going to be the drafter of the update of the SWP, and so it's going to be that qualified SWP developer that has to essentially look at those BMPs, that whole suite of BMPs, and convince themselves and be prepared to certify that that represents BAT for that particular facility, and that, of course, potentially could be challenged by the regional board if they do not feel it's adequate. But I would say if there's reason, if the developer has reason to believe that those changes will, in fact, and is presented the data to show that changing in sweeping from once a day to or once a week to once a day is sufficient, we go along with that. Or they may say that it has to be once a shift, but it's whatever they come up with. I can't imagine we'd second guess that too often, but we certainly can. And I just should say again that I don't expect to see effluent limits stay in this draft permit. So this idea of level 3 is probably going to go away. The other thing I should mention is one possibility, even though we may raise something like electrical conductivity or the action level for electrical conductivity, so we don't see as many people exceeding that right off the bat. There's in addition to BAT, BCT kind of looks at the BMPs, there's also the look to say what is the source of that pollutant of concern that's just causing an action level to be exceeded. And that could potentially, in some areas, hopefully not too many, be some sort of off-site cause. And there will be the possibility to clearly demonstrate that. Now, that you're not going to be able to just point upstream and say it's because of my neighbor Joe. There's going to be more of documentation and analysis required, but certainly that is a possibility, is to account for things that are beyond the facility's control and to ask for essentially no action as a result of that action level being exceeded, because we know where it's coming from and it's clearly not us.
And my guess is, again, pure speculation, I think we're going to see that come in significantly when we talk about atmospheric deposition. That's going to be one of the areas in which this beyond our control, if you will, outside of our industrial activities argument will play out.
Right. I mean, if some facility that doesn't handle copper at all happens to be right next to a freeway and is getting some copper brake pad deposition on their site and is hitting an NaL for copper, and they can show that it's likely coming from the atmosphere, that's exactly what you could argue. And I think we're not going to be open arms to those kind of arguments, but we're certainly going to look at them and act appropriately.
And I guess in closing, what that implicates is, again, a robust SWP and a robust monitoring and sampling program that allows the permittee to be able to make a good technical argument. Because I agree with Chris, just saying it's not mine, it came from the guy up the street. Yeah. It's not going to pass muster.
And without data, you got to have data, right? You can't have, you're supposed to sample 2 storms a year. I got 1 storm this year, and I got 1 storm 3 years ago. That's not going to help.
I don't think so.
This permit has a SWP checklist in it that is to be submitted with the PRDs. The other part of the planning and organization that's probably more comprehensive in this one is the identification of all the team members on the pollution prevention team. That would be all staff, the QSD, the QSP, of course, and what those responsibilities are, the procedures, the frequency, what the activity is, whether it's sweeping or pressure washing or covering of stockpiled materials. All of those positions need to be identified within the planning and organization part of the SWP. Alternate staff also need to be identified. For example, if someone is sick that day and there's someone else doing the sampling or the implementation portions of the SWP, those alternate staff need to be identified as well. Other requirements may be incorporated, for example, local MS4 or spill prevention control requirements. There could be some other elements within the pollution prevention phase of an industrial program that are not specifically part of the stormwater, but some other requirement, some other local requirement.
And I think that this makes sense, but certainly expands the breadth of the regulation. We really are going to we can no longer look at our SWP in isolation from our other regulatory requirements, which again asks a somewhat different question, which is the QSD who is preparing this document can no longer be doing so with blinders on. The QSD is really going to have to understand the facility and the universe of obligations that's imposed on that facility in order to make sure that these other requirements are incorporated and addressed.
Absolutely. Facility map needs to be included. So, the map, of course, needs to have a north arrow on it and a date and a scale. Those are the big ones. Needs to identify all the areas for observations, inspections, the boundaries of the facility, where the impervious or pervious areas are, landscaped areas. Basically, all the elements that we've been talking about here all need to be identified on the map. One of the interesting things is when you start getting in there and dividing out the little sub-areas within your facility, to aid in your identification of your sampling and or identification points is keeping in mind the concept of the daily average or the qualified combined samples portion of the sampling, which is kind of interesting to me, where you could perhaps take 2 or 3 sub areas and composite those together, or you would take several samples from an area and composite those together, and how that all comes together. And I want to ask Chris, what are your thoughts on the daily average and or compositing of samples from an industrial facility?
There was some language in the draft that's on the street now regarding limitations on compositing and only the lab doing it. Exactly what form, if any, that's going to carry over into the draft that's going to be issued at the end of August, I can't say at this point. Pretty hotly debated issue. Suffice it to say that I think looking at this issue closely and deciding whether it's one grab or continuous sampling or something in between, and how individual discharge locations within a facility get sampled and or combined with others is an issue that does need to be looked at very carefully by the qualified SWPPP developer. And at least in my mind, I suspect the permit, when it does get issued, will allow that SWPPP developer some freedom in doing that to represent the best interest of that facility. But it's not one grab sample of qualifying storm events per facility or per drainage area is likely to remain as the minimum requirement. But going beyond that, there may be a lot of reasons to do that, and that largely, I think, will end up being left to the SWPPP developer.
So there's some room for flexibility in the monitoring sampling program. It appears
I believe without certainty, but I believe that will be the case when the permit actually gets out in draft.
So grabs or something else. Listing of significant materials. This is whether they're stored or processed or they're sitting on the loading dock, the volumes, when they are received and shipped and stored, all the quantities, and, of course, the frequency. This would include raw materials, intermediate products, final products, recycled materials, and waste/disposed materials. Again, this is in the significant materials portion of the SWPPP, and it's very important that these areas where they're stored and the quantities are very well documented, especially from a spill and a loss prevention standpoint.
An interesting way to identify what was intended by this list is to go to the 11 questions in the non-exposure certification.
Right, and the EPA one.
Because it then, in that, and that's also on the State Board website, but when you look at it, it clearly identifies what you can't do and still comply with non-exposure. I believe that the converse of that is these are all the things that if you do any of these things have to be considered as a significant material.
Mm-hmm. And let me just comment on that, and this is just fresh in mind because I went to a facility just recently where this was the case, and that is a facility, industrial facility with a little bit of external exposure, but not a lot, and a stormwater management plan in place. But the owner of the facility had decided, for whatever reason, to bring his large motor yacht with fresh bottom paint on the facility and store it in the same area as his other outdoor storage, and the SWPPP did not, in fact, address that. Well, that would not be acceptable in this new permit in any way, shape, or form. That kind of storage of a boat with a bunch of copper bottom paint on it would definitely need to be addressed in the SWPPP if it was going to occur.
Even though it's not an industrial activity?
Well, it's out there on that industrial site that's subject to this permit,
okay.
So it gets included.
If it's a potential source of pollution.
Right.
So here are our pollutant sources. I don't know that there's anything here that is new or exciting, Sean, with the exception
if you're industrial property in the back area, you've got a cut slope at 45 degrees and you have no BMPs on it, well, that's an erodible surface. Essentially part of your industrial area. May not be an activity, but it's part of it, and could definitely contribute to TSS. And so that alone, I mean, you know, blowing through TSS and going through a couple NALs would probably be, you know, sufficient cause to either hydromulch or put vegetation or something like that on that erodible surface. But yeah, you're right. This is something new in this permit.
And you know, I don't think it's limited to you know, the cut slope, although that's clearly an issue.
Any erodible surface.
Any erodible surface. And how many industrial facilities do we look at that have outdoor parking or whatever that's unpaved, or you know, unpaved areas within, and it's sort of like, okay, we don't want to pave it, okay, because we don't want to create more impervious surface. On the other hand, we don't want it to be erodible because we don't want the silt and sediment discharge. And so I think this is going to be a new area for QSDs to find BMPs that address silt and sediment without increasing runoff as a result of more impervious area.
This slide, we'll just roll through this pretty quickly here. The minimum BMPs, of course, this is also in the current, under the current permit, good housekeeping, your inspections and observations, material tracking, covering of, isolation of, etc., all minimum BMPs. Preventative maintenance, so equipment inspections, especially for outdoor machinery. Storage containers, and are they covered or not? What kind of condition? Are they on pallets? Are they located near or further from storm drain locations? And a maintenance schedule. Any spills that occur, the procedures, what the disposal method was, training to prevent spills, and all the cleanup procedures, of course. Material handling and waste management, so again, covers and procedures, cleaning and inspections. Employee training, which Wayne spoke to earlier. So in this case, we need to identify the people who have been trained, what they've been trained to do, the schedule for their implementation, and what each one of those training activities is, whether it's sweeping or performing observations and documentation, and then copies of the training manuals. And my guess is with the added requirements here, I would probably recommend 2, maybe 3 training sessions per year for moderate-sized industrial facilities. If you're looking at a larger, you may want to do some kind of monthly training. At least you would include it in your, you know, a lot of facilities are doing health and safety training, so maybe you take a little bit of time every month in your health and safety to address stormwater. And of course, the record keeping and QA, all of these inspections, the training, any spills, BMPs, type of BMPs, maintenance, all needs to be very well documented, and those records need to be kept very well within the SWPPP for multiple reasons.
And this is the first permit in which I think we use the term quality assurance, and we mean it. Okay? I think it is different than previous permits where we talked about quality assurance at the laboratory level. This permit appears to me to be saying you have to have a quality control, quality assurance, demonstrable program in place. Now, I'm not sure that I understand all the elements of that. I'm not sure that that's fixed in stone and everybody has to do the same thing. But quality assurance and quality control, I think, is really, we're serious about it this time.
Again, erosion and sediment controls. This is something new here, but we talked about that a little bit. Any facility-specific BMPs, whether it's a drain inlet protection or some kind of custom water treatment facility or system, needs to be identified as well. A summary table of the BMPs, the areas and the activities that are associated with that, probably some rationale for why that BMP was selected based on that activity and the pollutant source. The annual comprehensive site evaluation would need to be conducted by the QSD or the QSP, includes reviewing all the inspection records, the observations, the sample data, sample times and dates, rainfall data, and conducting a visual inspection of the activities and pollutant sources, reviewing and evaluating the BMPs that are currently in place, making recommendations for new and or improved BMPs, production of this evaluation report, and then of course this is going to be uploaded to the SMARTS State Water Board database.
And I think that's critical because with the exception of data that's deemed to be secured by the Department of Homeland Security, and that's a pretty small exception, everything else becomes uploaded, available to the public, and transparent. So coming back to the old do what you say and say what you do, we're going to have to be able to document what did we say we were going to do, and did we do it, and what were the outcomes, and make that available to not just, you know, the state board and the regional board and the U.S. EPA and the Department of Justice and the municipalities, but also your neighbors.
Yeah, and kind of expanding on that, you know, all the documents, this is all electronic, so whether it's PDF or Excel or whatever the format is, it's all available to the public through this reporting system. So, you know, even if everything stayed the same as the current permit and you just had the requirement of uploading everything to the SMART system, I think just that alone would cause huge effort increases in these industrial stormwater programs, just that alone. So we'll talk a little bit here about the levels. So the level 0, which is basically your baseline requirements, and then the idea here is that as you move up through the ranks based on blowing through NALs, for example, you can move up. Theoretically, you can't move back down, but there are additional requirements both for reporting and observations and sampling for each level. And this is something we saw in the construction permit. We're seeing it in this permit. My understanding is that the new MS4 permit actually has a kind of a risk level approach too. So I think the intent, it's clear the intent from the Water Board that they want to rank these things, and I think it's long overdue. So this is a good thing.
And again, I think you can look at this and say, okay, in all probability, level 3 goes away. But if you look at level 0 through level 2, those 3 levels, and we look at the numeric action levels, one way that BAT, BCT may be defined is, okay, at level 0, good housekeeping is enough. Mm-hmm. But if I blow through it, I have to have, at level 1, operational controls. Mm-hmm. And by the time I get to level 2, I may have to have end-of-pipe treatment before discharge. So we're really seeing BAT, BCT.
At level 2, so that's the top of the...
Yeah, being defined in some ways, or at least what's acceptable.
And maybe I can comment on that. It may not define it completely, but certainly it's the way these levels are currently envisioned, and I don't see a change other than possibly the elimination of level 3, is that, in fact, the evaluation of actions that must be or potentially need to be taken as a result of approaching or exceeding an NAL would include those kind of structural treatments. It's not that you necessarily have to apply them, but certainly what may be considered BAT, BCT would include those as you get up in those other levels. And that's absolutely the intent.
In terms of the levels, with respect to the construction permit, a lot of the level or the risk levels based on your proximity to receiving water and things like that. Under the industrial permit, I don't see that as affecting your level as much as not meeting an NAL.
That is correct. And I'd expect to see that continue, that thinking continue. We looked at mirroring the construction permit thinking, and we're not able to do that.
But I think one thing it does say is, look, doing the same thing over again and expecting a different outcome is not going to be an acceptable, answer to a corrective action report.
So we'll briefly run through these in the interest of time because we'd like to be able to get to some of the questions here. Level 1 would be the operational source control corrective actions, implementation measures with the SWP and compliance with BAT, BCT, and a SWP revision. Now, if you have an NAL exceedance, then you would upload to SMARTS an NAL exceedance report and the SWP implementation schedule along with what you're proposing to do with your enhanced BMPs or additional BMPs, and of course the revised SWP that would reflect these changes. At a level 2, you must, of course, meet the level 1 requirements. At this point, you'd be looking at implementing structural and or treatment control BMPs or corrective actions, and the SWP revision needs to include these BMPs and descriptions of them in the maintenance schedule and who's responsible for all the same things we've been talking about here. As a level 2, if you were to exceed an NAL, the way the permit is written now, you would upload to SMARTS the level 2 NAL exceedance report, the new and enhanced BMPs that you're going to be implementing, along with the revised SWP. For the level 3, which we're surmising here probably will not stick, if it did, however, you'd be expected to meet the level 1 and 2 requirements. This is what would blow you into the NELs, at which point you'd be obligated to sample each and every qualifying storm event, not just 2 storm events per year, but each one, implement additional BMPs, and of course all of this needs to be certified by a PE. So again, this is likely not going to stick, but this is what it would have been, perhaps.
And I'd like Chris's input on this. I hear that NELs may not stick, but I'm not sure that things like a PE certification. Are we thinking level 3 is gone in toto, or?
Well, I can't speak with absolute certainty on that at all. However, I think there's an argument that at level 2, and whether or not we require a PE in the permit, the current state code may result in people believing they need to have a PE because you're addressing structural elements. And if you're doing engineering in the state of California, you must be an engineer. Now, we may not say that in that clear way, but certainly the Professional Engineers Licensing Board has provided comments to the state board that they believe that that's true, and they will enforce their licensing requirements on people doing work under this permit. So whether or not it's in the permit, it's worth thinking about on the part of the discharger. It could be that it will show up as a level 2 requirement. It could be that we will just be silent on the issue, but it's there, whether we write it down or not.
One last comment on these, and then we have to move along quickly so we will have time for questions, is that these corrective action reports, remember that even without numeric effluent limitation, this permit contains and must contain a prohibition against discharges to waters of the United States that can cause or contribute to the exceedance of a water quality objective. If you have a discharge that exceeds certainly a basin plan standard, probably a caltoxic standard, maybe a benchmark standard, that is prima facie evidence that you have discharged you have a discharge which could cause or contribute to the exceedance of a water quality objective. I do not think that regional boards will necessarily think this is a good place to use their enforcement powers. We have had recent case law, both in, as an example, NRDC versus County of Los Angeles, in which citizen groups have enforced, and the Ninth Circuit has upheld the enforcement. So, caution, you may have greater exposure blowing through a numeric action level than you really think. And so the goal should not be, I'll do whatever I need to do, and if I blow through it, I'll file a report and I'll do some more. The goal should be to get it right the first time.
Directly enforceable minimum reporting required to keep and maintain all records and ensure that management procedures are designed so the appropriate staff implements the permit requirements, including the SWIP and monitoring. I think this kind of goes back to, you know, who's responsible to do what, when, and how, and it all needs to be documented, especially since this is going to be in an electronic reporting format. Everything needs to be very clean.
And as our last slide, I think we'll go on to questions, but in response to any additional questions, or if there are things that we don't have an opportunity to answer for you today, you have our contact information. This is a developing permit. There will be additional opportunities for you to participate, and we anticipate in September having another one of these webinars which will help update you on where we are and look more specifically at the monitoring and reporting program. And with that having been said, we'll take questions, or we can start to go through the Q&A list.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you have a question at this time, please press star and then 1 on your telephone. And if your question has been answered or you wish to remove yourself from the queue for any reason, please press the pound key. One moment while we wait for questions. Our first question comes from Sid. Your line is open.
Sid?
Check your mute button, please.
Hi, this is Sid. This question is towards Chris. Chris, earlier you had mentioned that you were shooting for, not you, but the state is shooting for a January 10th approval, and that the next draft is due out in the end of August. Is that correct?
That's correct. Towards the end of August, the draft, and actually adoption of the permit on our the January 10th board meeting.
Thank you.
Once again, ladies and gentlemen, if you would like to ask a question, please press star and then 1. I am showing no further questions.
Why don't we work through some of the ones that have been sent in via email. And the first question is from Dylan Wright. What constitutes readily available in terms of being overseen by a QSP? And Dylan, I think what you're asking us is, does the QSP have to be on the site? I don't see anything in the permit, and Chris should chime in on this. I don't see anything in the permit that requires it. I think what the permit does require is an analysis of what are the duties and responsibilities of the QSP, and then you may be able to have to ask some logical questions about whether or not that has to be a permanent employee on site, or how you're going to achieve compliance with those duties and responsibilities.
And I certainly agree with that. I might add a little bit to that if it's an employee who's not a QSP doing this work, whether it's sweeping the floor consistent with a BMP, or checking, doing a weekly or daily or shift inspection that's documented, that person must be appropriately qualified and trained. And Sean mentioned that might be appropriate to include those kind of training records in with safety. That's certainly something that many facilities do, but there should be documentation that that person who's doing that work is appropriately trained and qualified to do it, whatever it is. And of course, that varies according to what they are in fact doing, whether it's sampling or doing actually some field measurement with portable equipment, or it's just sweeping the floor. But certainly even the person that's sweeping the floor should know that they're doing that because there is a stormwater requirement.
And I think that leads into Bob Capiello's question, which is, will there be a qualified person certification or class to take to say you are qualified?
I think it's almost certain, this is Chris again, that there will be those kind of classes for the QSD as in Delta and QSP as in Papa, so the SWP developer and practitioner. For the others that may be working in this area, no, there won't be a state managed process, but clearly your SWP and your implementation of that on your site should have some assurance that they've received appropriate training and that you have documentation that that has been completed.
Going on to our next question, Jennifer Kaminsky, and my apologies to all of you as I murdered your names, asks, is there a requirement that the QSP actually perform all of the sampling and inspections, or can the QSP oversee these activities and have other personnel assist with these functions?
I think my interpretation is you could have the oversee. So ultimately the P, as in Paul, would be responsible for and obviously responsible for training and documenting that these sampling staff and inspection staff have been trained in how to do that properly. But, you know, to have all of those inspections and sampling be performed by the QSP seems, it could be a stretch, especially if that P is overseeing several different, you know, locations. But if that QSP is assigned to that site, in other words, they're an employee of that facility, then by all means they should do the bulk of that work. But my interpretation at this point would be that, yes, there would be some sort of designee, you know, of the P, similar to the construction permit.
I would agree. I think my only caveat would be, while the QSP can delegate those responsibilities, I do not see that within this permit that the QSP can delegate the liability for failure to perform. If the permit says you're going to sample at this point, if your SWP says you're going to sample at this point, at this time, and and it doesn't happen, the fact that you delegated it to if you're the QSP and you've delegated it to somebody else, does not terminate your obligation or your liability for performance. And this comes back to that question of authority, responsibility. If you're going to be responsible for these things and you're going to delegate them, do you have the authority to make sure it's actually going to happen? And asked, can we do a summary on the website of the map contents requirements? And yeah, I think we can do that. Maybe we can get that posted as part of our next webinar.
The facility map?
Yeah, the list of
facility map?
Yep.
Yeah, sure, we can do that. And I think what we'll do for the next webinar is we'll take a facility map like that and sort of identify how you would look at the sub-areas within that, and we could definitely address some of the elements that need to be on that map as well.
And I think we have come to the end of our list of email Q&A questions. Are there other questions from the audience that we can answer?
Once again, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to ask a question, please press star and then 1. Now, I don't have any other questions.
Because I think we just get no, I think we have covered them all. Then we want to thank you all for your participation.
Bill record QSP vendor offering QSP services. Any idea on?
Oh, maybe we missed that one.
Oh no, the bill record one. Where did it go?
Oh wait. I thought I learned how to manage this a minute ago.
I think that audience participant dropped off and their question disappears when they drop off.
Then we want to thank you all for your participation. If you have further questions, you have our email addresses, and we would just request that you fill out the questionnaire, and so that we can do a better job next time. We heard your comments, and we will certainly do something to adjust the microphones for next time so that you can hear us better.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, this does conclude your conference. You